Welcome to Tuesday of the Passion Week. On Monday, you remember, Jesus cleansed the temple. And the gospel writers tell us that he essentially took control of the Temple Mount. He wasn't allowing anyone to carry goods through, and so really for Monday and Tuesday of the Passion Week, he basically commandeers the entire Temple Mount. He takes control of it as its rightful owner. Then on Tuesday morning, he and his disciples leave Bethany, where they've been staying with their friends, just over the Mount of Olives, 2 miles from the Temple Mount, and he returns again to the temple. The gospel writers tell us that this becomes a day of teaching. Jesus is there on the Temple Mount, that huge 35-acre area where the temple stood. Somewhere between 200 and 300,000 pilgrims were likely there for the Passover week. And so there would have been tens of thousands of people milling about on the top of the Temple Mount. And on Tuesday, Jesus begins to teach. And in the context of his teaching, the Pharisees and the Sadducees are hanging around in the background, listening to his teaching, and they're looking for ways to trap him. And in response to his teaching, they question his authority. By what authority, they say, do you do these things? That was probably a reference to his cleansing of the temple, certainly to his teaching, as well, of course, his sanction of the events that had happened on Sunday in the triumphal entry. So the question is, by what authority are you doing these things? Now Jesus, knowing that they have no intention of responding to him in his authority, he in turn asked them a question. Why had they not responded to John the Baptist? Was he from heaven, or was he speaking merely for men? They realize they can't answer that question without finding themselves in a trap. If they say that John's from heaven, then the question will be, why didn't you listen to him? And if they say, no, he's from men, then they're going to find themselves in serious trouble with the people, because the people believe that John was a genuine prophet. They don't answer. They refuse to answer. And so Jesus, in turn, refused to answer them. He essentially says, look, you're not going to respond to my authority. The Father has already demonstrated that in so many ways. And if you refuse to hear me, then there's no need for me to give you any further answer to your questions, to somehow establish my authority. In response to that, Jesus then tells 3 parables that are an indictment of Israel's leaders. You have, first of all, the parable of the 2 sons. In this parable, Jesus indicts them for having refused to listen to God's will as it was taught and preached and prophesied by John the Baptist. And then he tells the parable of the vineyard, and that indicts them as a people for having rejected the prophets that God sent. He details how they've treated the prophets and how they've treated then God's only Son. And that's really where this parable goes. In the parable of the vineyard, the Father says, I've sent all of my servants. They haven't listened to them. I'll send my Son. Surely they'll respect him. And of course, the leaders have determined that the solution to their problem is to put the Son to death. Jesus is indicting them because that's exactly where the Jewish leaders were. Some 6 weeks before, after he had raised Lazarus from the dead, the Sanhedrin had decided that Jesus had to die. Then, after those parables, Jesus tells the parable of the wedding feast. And in that parable, he indicts them for having rejected the invitation of salvation that was from the Father offered to them through Jesus. So there are these parables that confront them right there on the Temple Mount in the middle of everyone, in the middle of the Passover crowds. They in turn respond with a series of questions in which they try to undermine Jesus. They try to trip him and trap him in some way where they can accuse him, arrest him, and possibly even put him to death. And of course, as you would expect from our Lord, he responds with profound wisdom to each of those questions. You'll read about them in today's reading. But from there, Jesus launches into an indictment of the Pharisees head on. And you'll read the 7 woes that he pronounces on them for their apparent spirituality, which was utterly and completely devoid of any real heart for God. It's right there on the Temple Mount, their territory, on Tuesday of the Passover week with tens of thousands of people listening in, and he pronounces these woes upon them. On the heels of that, Jesus then walks across the Temple Mount and goes into that area called the Court of the Women. And in the Court of the Women, there were receptacles there for the temple offering. And he sits down and watches as people give their offerings. And he watches a poor widow put her 2 mites into the offering. And we're told that it's all that she had to live on. Now, this story is misunderstood, I think, most of the time. In fact, it may be the most misunderstood story in the New Testament. The story of the widow's mite is not telling you to follow her example. The Gospels are clear that on the heels of this event, Jesus pronounces the destruction of the temple. And in both cases where this story occurs, before the story of the widow's mite, Jesus has just indicted the Pharisees for devouring widows' houses. And he sits there and watches this happen in the case of this poor woman who gives all that she has, when the heart of God is to take care of widows and to give to them, not to pull from them. So Jesus, having seen this, walks across the Temple Mount. He watches this poor woman put in all she has to live in, and then he totally renounces a system that preys on the needy like this poor widow. He walks out of the temple, never to return during his earthly ministry. He then ascends the Mount of Olives and sits down there, and looking back across the valley, the Kidron Valley, back to the Temple Mount, he delivers the Olivet Discourse, in which he explains the future. And in unfolding that future, he prophesies the destruction of the temple. Not one stone will remain upon another because of the wickedness of what's going on there. The city of Jerusalem will be destroyed. And then he goes on to describe all of the events that will unfold all the way to the end of this age and to his second coming. It's really a remarkable day, Tuesday, in the life and ministry of our Lord. Enjoy the readings for today.